We now have a very special wrap-up to this section just before break, where Janet Woodcock is going to speak to us. And her contributions over the years and her career are so many and so visible, she doesn't really need an introduction. However, protocol requires that I force her to listen to yet another introduction of Janet Woodcock. So she is the director of the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research and acting director of the Office of New Drugs at the FDA. And in her years at the FDA, she has held a cascade of ever more responsible roles as detailed in your program, as are her academic accomplishments. Now, what you may not know is that Janet has long been an advocate of learning systems and platform trials. For example, she is widely credited with the innovation of the master trial protocol, without which platform trials would not exist today. So thank you for that. Today, Dr. Woodcock will continue to push our thinking on how to evolve platform trials into more holistic and disease-focused innovation engines. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Woodcock.
We got here. Okay. All right. So, morning, everyone. Great to be here. Wonderful to hear that announcement. I'll be interested to find out the details of what's going to be done. That's exciting. My title, anyone who knows me well would know I would never write a title like this. However, I'm very compliant. And so that's the title. So I'm going to talk about this. I won't mention the title, though. A little too fancy for my preference, okay? But this is really, how do we get, what Gigi asked me to do is say, how are we going to get from here to there? Like, what is the sort of practical vision or steps to get to the vision? So let me talk about that. First of all, I think we all know, and we were just discussing, there is a burning platform, right? The problem is the various silos or sectors we've been talking about, they think a different platform is burning. So nobody agrees. Everybody agrees there's a burning platform, but nobody agrees on what's burning. First of all, there's a lack of evidence base for healthcare practice. So this is just very clear. And so I think a lot of what we're talking about, how much money is spent, okay, in healthcare and how these new drugs, which are only a fraction of the money that is spent, a lot of this is because we spend money on non-evidence-based practices. Almost everything that is done in healthcare is a non-evidence-based practice reflecting expert opinion, right? Or social desires. And don't get me started on how we actually reimburse for healthcare activities, because that doesn't have any rationality either to it. The people who are in the insurance industry here probably know that. It's a lot of habit, and this is how we've always done it. And even who does it? I would argue, do you need, 25 years of training to take somebody's appendix out? No. Or do a colonoscopy. But no, we pay the highest priced people around to do that kind of stuff. So there's a lot of things that could be fixed. But most practice guidelines don't reflect expert opinion. They do reflect expert opinion's huge accrual of habit and practice over many decades. We know, when it's already been discussed, we need a learning healthcare system that actually can generate evidence so it continuously improve itself. It's like 50 years behind any other industry as far as its ability to change based on, data and input. And the cost of healthcare, we just said, is rising and not sustainable. And that's true overall, not just for drugs or medical products, right? So what about medical products, though, which is the subject of this conference? It's really the high cost of clinical evaluation is the killer, especially where many are tried, many are called, few are chosen, right? So the opportunity costs are tremendous. And continued criticism, though, from certain parties in this city, okay, or across the river, okay, about even when we get a drug on the market and have spent $750 million or $1 billion developing it, we still don't know how to use it very well, right? And that's just actual fact of the matter, right? And so there's room for criticism there, but putting all that pre-market, we'd never then get any drugs, or if there would be drugs that would be approved, they'd be so expensive that nobody would pay for them, as we already discussed. So the generation of evidence in the pre-market side also is too expensive and is becoming unsustainable. And as we already heard, society is balking at even new advances. I mean, to find a drug that alters the disease course of spinal muscular atrophy, no one would have thought that was possible 10 years ago. They'd have thought that was way in the future. And yet to find that, to have it offered to people, and then to say, well, we're going to ration this because of its cost. So neither of the above have currently have sustainable solutions. So everything that's been put forward are solutions, or patchwork solutions, and they're not going to fix these two problems. So vision, which we've already been talking about, the vision is to bake in evidence generation or learning, or whatever you want to call it, into the whole process of healthcare. And that would require, really, and if you think about what you've been talking about, this is what it would require. You have to reintegrate clinical research and clinical care. The very oldest clinician, oldest in the sense of hundreds of years ago, they were all experimenters, right? Because nobody knew what to do. And so experimentation and learning was baked into medicine early, but now, because partly the reimbursement system and a whole bunch of things, those two processes are so far apart, it's awful. And when community clinicians are engaged, they're basically like paid hands, hired hands, right? Just roll the patients through, see a bunch of patients. Their intellectual input, nor the patients, is really solicited. And if we could reintegrate clinical research and clinical care, and don't forget, this is the long-term vision, okay? Use the process, this integrated process, to systematically improve health outcomes. This is how you lower the costs, okay, is you fix the system, okay? And you lower the costs systemically rather than picking on different products that seem too expensive and beating up on them, or by disadvantaging people of certain insurance plans, or this, that, or the other thing. We have to fix the system. Evaluate the new intervention technology in the context of standard of care in the real world. That standard of care should be continuous evaluation of what works in the real world. That's what we need to have. Integrate the community of practice into the scientific inquiry process. They have a tremendous amount to contribute, but they are almost shut out by their role as money generators, basically, and billing people and units out there. Dramatically lower the cost of giving evidence of what works, both pre-market, post-market. This is a continuum. There's no reason that we have two totally separate systems. So I would say that's the vision, is that we're going to bake in an evidence generation process. Now, some of these other things you've been talking about, like using the data, well then, to do this, you have to make the data, you have to solve the data problem, right? Current state, okay, we've been talking about this too. This is the despair part, right? It is very far from the desirable state. In fact, we don't even know how we're going to get there. Majority of evidence generation that's usable, as was said earlier, is either industry or government-sponsored trials. And by government-sponsored, I mean all around the world. Governments are sponsoring trials. Systematic use of digital health data is not widely used to improve practice. And when you try to use it, you know, you understand the deficiencies of the health records. Academic reward system, so shouldn't the academic community, meaning the biomedical research community, be working on this? No, their reward system is completely different. It has to do with basic science research in general, and has to do with individual contributions to biomedical research. So it's just antithetical to what we're trying to achieve here. And we just have to realize that. I would say one of the things that should be started early, Gigi, is set up prizes for those who, and awards and recognition for those who are willing to work in a new way. Industry, so whatever the industry, the pharmaceutical industry, biotech industry assumes tremendous risk every time they do something. And, they have this huge risk because they fail all the time. They fail routinely, and that's one of the problems. It's a disincentive to change, though, because when you fail so often, what you want to do is you want to repeat the time that it worked. And you don't want to change anything. You want to do everything the same as that one time something actually got through. And the reg affairs people, like their power base, with all due respect for those in the room who are in their power base is saying, oh, the FDA will never let you do anything, right? And so that maintains control and power. No, that's honestly true, or EMA for all I know. So the reg affairs job is to say, no, don't change anything, because the FDA would never let you do anything like that. And so then they become the gurus, and people have to listen to them. And that, as was just said, we've done this in manufacturing over the past 5 years or 10 years along with MIT, and we've driven a paradigm of change in the industry on how drugs are manufactured. And we're starting to see continuous manufacturing and other innovations, but it's required demonstration projects in academia and then a few companies stepping forward and so forth. And us, frankly, in the FDA, changing over, getting some more forward-thinking people, changing our structure and so forth to enable that. But there's no reason that, the manufacturing was the same way. It wasn't evidence-based either. So but our hugest problem, this doesn't apply to the people in this room, but if you think about everyone else in the ecosystem almost, they don't even understand or believe there's a problem. Most people think the problem is that pharmaceutical companies are greedy, okay? That's one definition that you see a lot. Other people would say, like the academics would say, well, we need more money for research, right? Or whatever your sector you're looking at, it's not just the processes are siloed, the vision is siloed, the analysis is siloed. So that's, in my mind, is the biggest problem. I gave what's called the Shattuck Lecture a couple years ago to Mass Medical Society for the New England Journal. Okay? And I talked about all this, and the sea of blank faces in front of me was incredibly discouraging. It was awful. I don't think I've ever talked to a group that really had no comprehension of what I was talking about. So, I never did write that up because I thought, what am I going to say? Anybody will understand. Maybe I should do cartoons or something. So they really don't believe it, because for the academics, this works. For current people in pharmaceutical industry, if they're successful, this works, right? For the practitioner out in the community, it works. Sort of. And, what it doesn't work for is the patients. And the patients are starting to rise up and say, and is this refusal to pay and these rationings and so forth something they've dreamed for so long? And then they say, no, you can't have this because our system is so dysfunctional. We can't figure out a way to manage this. I think that's going to cause some changes. But it might not be the right changes. Because part of the problem that has occurred is this disease exceptionalism, going to Congress and lobbying for one disease at a time. It's given us 27 institutes at NIH, or 50, or however many there are. That's not a very effective way when they're all doing basic biomedical research and so forth. So the current state leaves a lot to be desired. So what about who's doing what now? Well, we've heard some of this. Current steps, the NIH Collaboratory, which was put together, it's a temporary thing, but I think it again showed clearly that important evidence can be generated in the course of medical practice and generated cheaply, okay? And they were lucky because they were using standard care comparisons and they didn't have to go through a lot of the IRB stuff and so forth. But Multiple efforts are ongoing in oncology because they have to, because as was earlier said, there's such a pressure of science and new therapies coming forward. So platform trials are ongoing. You'll hear about some of those, and more are being set up. Real-world evidence, such as the Flatiron effort, what ASCO is doing to collect from real world. All of those, and I think Laura Esserman will probably talk about this, all these require curation, though, of the collected data. It's not good enough. Whoever said that, absolutely. It's not good enough to use just straight off the health record. Public-private partnerships. We're sponsoring with Reagan-Udall Institute IMEDS, and IMEDS is using the Sentinel network set up for companies to join into and do their own analyses. We would like to turn the Sentinel structure into a public-private resource that many researchers could use those resources as well. And that would be for whatever the companies want to look at. But you can use Sentinel, which is mainly claims data. You can use it for outcomes, safety, or effectiveness, or what have you. PCORnet, IMI is doing a lot. I've spoken to them numerous times. And again, this is in more of the setting up platform trials and so forth and trying to break down some of those silos. And Odyssey, which is looking at observational data and trying to work out new methodologic ways to make those data usable. And that came out of the OMOP partnership that industry funded and I was involved in. And then 21st Century Cures legislation that was recently passed has commanded FDA to develop and publish a framework for how we're going to use real-world evidence. All right, so based on those examples, I think I want to talk about how can we realistically drive a transition. And I'm not sure, I don't know what your project is going to do, but hopefully that will be doing some of it. But I want to talk about using platform trials to drive this transition. So the pace of scientific discovery, as we said, the need for commercialization of these products, we can't just have them out there without getting developed. And the costs, which we've talked about all this already, provide strong incentives in many sectors. We've got to do this differently. It's not sustainable. So use of public-private partnerships to cost share some of the infrastructure burdens makes a lot of sense. Integration of community practitioners, I think, it will be necessary to sustain recruitment in these rapidly growing fields. For example, in cancer, if we have a large number of checkpoint inhibitors, people aren't going to be able to find the patients in the academic medical centers. But we know that 95% of people with cancer don't get into a trial, and we know a lot of them want to. And that's because the trial infrastructure in the United States doesn't reach out into the community. And when it has, they want to reach out and suck the patient into an academic medical center. And that's not what the community practitioners want to do, or the patients. They don't want to travel hundreds of miles when they're really sick. So a new model, looks like I'm over time, would be really good. The current widespread use of the electronic health record really enables this data collection.
You have another 10 minutes.
Oh, okay, good, thank you. So how to get started? When does it make sense to use the platform trial? Well, the current problem with platform trial is who's going to fund such a thing, right? You would think that countries, now that they're paying so much money for health care, that they would have some kind of organized approach to evaluating it and assessing it and bringing it, but they don't. Okay, so the pharmaceutical companies and others, device companies, have been made to do the innovation. The academic sector of medical care, academic medicine, has been left to do typically small little studies, on this and that, and nobody really is in charge of determining how should we do healthcare. So funding is a problem. But one place money will be invested is drug development because of all this science coming forward. So maybe the new digs will be able to do something broader. But I think for drug development, you could get the money. You need a scenario if you're going to do a platform trial or master protocol. You need a scenario where you have multiple candidate drugs in the pipeline. In other words, you have to have a pipeline that keeps flowing, and you have to have people who are willing to invest up front to have that capacity. It's very helpful to have a strong, vocal, and relatively united patient community. A lot of the patient communities squabble with each other and are, at each other's throats, partly because they haven't had this mutual hill to climb. I think if they understand what the challenge is, they can get united around it, but this really helps. We need a core of committed academic investigators willing to take the risks, including the hit, possibly to their own advancement in the traditional academic medical sounds like a lawyer, right? And healthcare systems with large practitioner networks. And the good news is those healthcare systems are getting bigger and bigger every year, networking out into the community. So advantages of platform trials under these circumstances, the huge advantage is faster recruitment and sharing screening when you have multiple candidates. This may be critical in the area of targeted therapy, because we all know one of the first targeted therapies in cancer, they had to screen about 1,000 people for every candidate they got. Well, wouldn't it be better to have a trial where those people can be shunted into other sub-studies rather than having to be rescreened later or turned away? That's not good. Shorter time and lower individual startup costs for those individual development programs, because the trial's already running. You just plug the product in. Trusted, experienced investigators. I don't think this can be emphasized. If you have investigators who are doing the same type of work over and over again, they're going to get better and better. And much of the effort that goes in is the training and the checking and the monitoring and all this. This can be dispensed with eventually. Standardized data collection, because the other thing at the other end is this year of data cleanup where they go and verify every data point and so forth. This can be dispensed with if you get your infrastructure right. Shared control groups, that could be a tremendous benefit. Of course, that means you're a head-to-head competitor with the other group, and some people don't like that, right? But on the negative balance side, larger initial startup investment, both of time and money, right, to get this started. And we've tried, and it doesn't work very well with direct competitors. They don't want to be in the same trial together. But fortunately, there's so many different types of drug candidates being developed that shouldn't be too bad of a... So what are the advantages, not for just efficiency, but for everybody, for the public sector and patient advocacy? First of all, to me, the biggest advantage of platform trials is they turn the focus to continuous disease improvement rather than evaluating one single intervention of one type or another. The goal is to make the patients who have this disease survive better, feel better, function better, right? And the goal would be to develop methods to assess their function, feelings, and survival in the most best way possible. It can be more inclusive of patients. Like I said, you don't have to turn away all these people. And you can ask treatment policy or comparative effectiveness questions. So you can be running sub-studies that are looking at investigational drugs, but at the same time, you can be running studies looking at, should we start the person on this set of treatments and then put them on this set, or should we start them this way and then, so modify standard of care within the same platform rather than having to try to figure out through an NIH grant in 5 years or something whether you could do that kind of study. And This may become very important. Somebody talked about this earlier as we move, I think it was Hans Geyer, because we move away from like the mean population person, like the average person who's who we describe in a trial is imaginary. There is no average person, right? So we're going to move from which therapy is best for the average person, which is what the classic trial asks, to who to treat with what, when. Right? And those type of questions do best in adaptive, multi-arm type of ongoing study. Faster learning, especially with adaptive design, integration of community could hasten adoption of best practices and decrease translation time. That's the other outrageous thing for the patients. Academic medical centers in the New England Journal may publish the latest and greatest findings, but the people in the community are still being treated with 20-year-old, and this is a consequence of those two silos, clinical practice over here, research over here. The desired trajectory for platform trials, I think they should become well-integrated engines eventually. So we start them for drug development, but eventually they could study the natural history, biomarker performance. You won't need registries. You put that as part of your platform and follow, and long-term outcomes. You can do outcome measures. You can develop new outcome measures, such as patient-reported outcomes in such a setting. So it'd be a big tent for researchers. New interventions obviously continued to be studied in treatment policy and comparative evidence. And then enable true patient-centered inquiry. This, having a standing platform enables the patients to have meaningful and continuous input into how everything is done and how everything is interpreted and what is important to study. So in summary, I'm a little 16 seconds over, sorry. A vision for the learning healthcare system. Actually, it's clear, it's totally achievable from a technological point of view, right? This isn't rocket science. We could be there yesterday. But we have all these cultural, social, habit, all these barriers, and a lot of financial barriers. I'm not a financial type. I don't understand this very well. But the way physicians are reimbursed by insurance companies provides, Mark McClellan taught me this, like major disincentives to behaving in a patient-centered way, okay? Most agile sector, so we need long-term strategy and a vision that everyone understands. But then we're going to have to get way back, and what are the short-term tactical steps we can start getting there? The most agile sector is probably drug development, and drug development, believe me, is not agile. But compared to the healthcare system, it's like a miracle of, agility. So I think we will need to take small, achievable steps, even within the drug development space, and do platform trials under favorable conditions, keep working on these, and get the world used to them. I mean, I can tell you 3 years ago when I did that Shattuck lecture, nobody in that room had ever heard of this. This was like news to them, and it didn't make any sense. Now, more and more people have heard of it. As we get more trials up and running, people will understand. And then what we need to do at the same time, and obviously people are working on the real-world evidence, getting the digital health data, trying to get it into some kind of state that can eventually be merged over time with these kind of platform efforts. And eventually we can kind of midwife or bring about the birth of a learning healthcare system. So that was what I was asked to talk about. That's my proposal. Thank you very much.
Would you like to take any questions or not? We'll take a couple minutes, yeah. Okay. So we'll take a couple minutes for questions, go into the break a bit. And while you're thinking of that, wasn't it remarkable how we started with a burning platform and wound up with an oven that was baking in evidence all the way along? I've never seen a wildfire so carefully and well contained. A question or two for about 5 minutes or so. Thanks.
Hi.
Introduce yourself, please.
Yes, Stacey Abramsky-Rissman with Pfizer. I'm an epidemiologist with Pfizer, and I work with real-world data and analytics. And I think this idea of baked-in evidence generation is very interesting. And I think one of the things that is one of the very major built-in problems that we have with this is attitudes. I think in the US, there is this very strong distinction between clinical practice and research, because these are sort of societal attitudes that have existed, and it is going to be very difficult to overcome these. I think that in real world data, we are starting to and have been looking at claims data, EHR data, and that kind of stuff, but it's data that's collected for clinical purposes that were sort of, square peg and a round hole kind of thing. And I think about work that I've done ex-US using, like Swedish registers and all kinds of other systems that are much more set up for that kind of thing. And so I think that one of the things we need to really keep an eye on is what can we do that's going to help us in this country make that shift to what, I guess, was it Hans-Georg said earlier about, making that shift from it's dangerous to look at your data to it's dangerous not to. And what can we do in this country to make that happen?
Yeah, well, I would say in general, the patient community is already there. The problem is there is a group of people who really value privacy beyond anyone else, are very suspicious of others and this and that and the other thing. What I'm proposing is as we move, and you'll hear more of this from Laura, I think, and we're working with other people on this as well. We're working a lot with Laura. As we move the practitioners themselves, into doing more activities that are research. They can't be very complicated. We're going to have to integrate research into the workflow of the clinicians in order to make it work. And if people need special tests and everything, that's what CROs should do in the new world, is they should make sure everybody gets all the tests they need and all this stuff. And we can't, in other words, we can't overburden clinicians, but we should invite practitioners into the research enterprise and tell them they're valuable, because they are, and that their patients are valuable. And what we want is the patients to be able to stay in place, not have to move their doctor, not have to change doctors, not have to travel 150 miles to a health center, but can be treated in place. And these would be these master protocols would do this, just start reaching out. There are parties who want to be the facilitator. So that's an entrepreneurial thing. They're CROs or like CROs who would like to be that glue that holds the community and the master protocol together, for example. So I think it's all doable. And I think that the need for better recruitment will drive this kind of behavior, which we need financial incentives to make these things happen, right?
You think that the clinicians coming on board will bring the patients along?
Yeah, well, we'll ask them to enroll their patients, but we'll say you won't have to do all this paperwork, that a PI would have to do or something. We'll support you, but we want you to continue your care of the patient, but certain data points that you enter have to be right. And so we're going to have to cut back on our thirst for massive amount of data and everything. But the trade-off there is we'll get numbers, we'll get a lot of patients, and we'll also begin to align. And the collaboratory did this. They had to go out and work with the clinicians, and talk to them and find out how to best integrate those things into their flow of work. But that is doable. And see, this rigid good clinical practices, this, that, and the other thing, that has been a tremendous barrier, because then you're not good enough to do what we want you to do. And you'd have to do all this other stuff, and it's really complex, and it has a lot of paperwork, and there's a 50-page case report form. Clinicians in practice are not going to do that. So the trade-off, though, is we get valuable information that is very like real-world information. But what happens to people in the real world and when we do this.
Excellent thought. Chris, questions? Responses.
Sorry.
And then we'll go to break.
I will modify my question. I think that one of the areas we really can do some work with in clinical trials is with futility. We need to be able, from the FDA perspective and all perspectives, to be much more succinct around when we stop something that we have started. Could you please comment on that from a regulatory perspective?
Thank you, John.
Right, well, from a regulatory perspective, stopping a trial for futility is the sponsor's their prerogative. End of discussion.
Can't we have some guidelines for making a certain threshold so that at least the within reason, as a starting point, I'm not trying to say you live and die by those things, but at least as the trigger point. Otherwise, we have so many things going on that could be stopped.
Okay, well, again, the futility, it requires interim looks, right, at the data. And so you lose a little bit of alpha every time you do that. But it's up to the sponsor to decide how far they want to take a trial and, what kind of treatment effect they want to roll out. And they can decide if we're not going to get that treatment effect at the end of the trial, we can just stop. So I hear you on stopping on futility. Probably the regulatory part of that has more to do with the interim looks that are needed and what kind of, and we have issued a lot of information on that.
Great, thank you. One last question, then we'll go to break.
Hi, Ramsey Dagger from Pfizer. Just quickly, you didn't say it directly, but from your remarks, I gather that you view the role of platform trials within this broader, systemic change, both pre-market and post-marketing as well, and maybe even a hybrid of where some drugs are coming from a pre-market space and some. Is that fair? Can you elaborate?
Yes, well, that was what I was talking about. I would say a master protocol, would be a protocol that would just test a certain question. A trial platform could have several master protocols running within it. What I see is starting up few master protocols first in different areas, getting people used to them. Then they'll need more recruitment and they can bleed out into the community, and we'll have to figure out how to support the community docs in order to get them to participate, And then you can start adding these other things on. Well, we want a registry with this newly approved drug. Well, why not use the platform? It's already set up, they're following the patients and so forth. And you want to qualify a new biomarker. We have all these PIs out there, they have the patients, right? They're following them. That can be a kind of another add-on or a PRO or whatever. So, and it also could be used for looking at adverse events in a post-marketing cohort type of way. So once you think about it, you think, why did we do this any other way, right? But no, we're going to continue to do it the way we're doing it, mostly for the next 10 years. So what we need to do is make these transitions, demonstrate the advantages, and gradually people will, I think, move over to a really totally new way of doing business eventually.
Excellent. Thank you. What a wonderful conclusion. Thank you, Janet.